Hey again, this is Jerry Roberts, and we're going to start our discussions of the Jehovah's Witnesses religion. I've chosen to set this up into 5 separate sections so that no one particular video gets too terribly long. So the first section we're going to look at is going to be a short history of Jehovah's Witnesses. Jehovah's Witnesses are also called the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society. That's the real official name of their organization. The Watchtower Announcing Jehovah's Kingdom is also their name. It's very important to understand that this is a very short version of the history of Jehovah's Witnesses. At the very end of this presentation, I will have a slide that will show you some other resources. The history of Jehovah's Witnesses is very complicated. They've had so many changes, so many times they've prophesied the end of the world or the coming of Christ that has failed. So many changes in their doctrines, their teachings, their literature, that it's really just not possible to cover it. And you would almost have to have a full course just in Jehovah's Witnesses in order to focus on all of that. So I'm just going to hit the highlights of some of the basic things that we need to know about where the Jehovah's Witness religion came from. And so we start out, the founder of the Jehovah's Witness religion is Charles Taze Russell. You can see him in the picture there. He grew up in a Christian church, but he also had some interesting family background and stuff, and because of that he rejected a lot of the doctrines of Christianity in his youth, and especially he didn't care for the idea of eternal punishment. This idea of hell or eternal punishment really bothered him, and so he, over the process of time, he kind of rejected some of those teachings and some of those doctrines. As he got a little older, in 1876, he met a man named Nelson Barber. And Nelson Barber actually was an Adventist, meaning that he actually was a person who was focused on the coming of Christ, this cataclysmic happenings that were going to happen. And during this time, there was a lot of Adventist furor because of the fact that it was getting close to the change in a century. And a lot of people believed that before this change in the century, something weird and amazing was going to take place. In 1874, Barber had actually, in his magazine, had predicted that Jesus was going to return to the earth in 1874. And so when this didn't happen, Barber actually changed his teaching. And then once again, this is not Russell yet. This is Barber, and this is one of Russell's, I guess you would say, mentors. Barber changed his teaching. And what he said was that Christ's invisible presence had come to earth in 1874, that Christ had not come physically, but his invisible spiritual presence had come to earth in 1874, and he was now already working behind the scenes to establish his kingdom on earth. Now, it's interesting to notice this. There's already this tendency to, when a prophecy doesn't work out, you just relabel the prophecy. So, Russell worked in Barber's organization for a while. He worked for 3 years with him, learned as much as he could from him, I guess. And then he actually split off and formed his own organization. And his organization was called Zion's Watchtower. Zion's Watchtower organization. And actually, it's interesting that this is a cover of one of the early magazines. And you notice a very interesting thing to notice here, and we'll talk about this in a minute, but you notice this was called the Watchtower and Herald of Christ's Presence. All right? Notice how that is phrased, and understand that that's not what the Watchtower magazine is called today. But Russell began teaching and writing books, promoting his views. He had a lot of strong views. He spoke very strongly against Christendom, against the Christian church. He spoke that the Jehovah's Witnesses, actually, once again, at that point, they weren't called Jehovah's Witnesses yet. At that point, they were called Bible students. By outsiders, they were called Russellites. And so that's what their teachings were, that they were the only ones who knew the truth and that all other churches were wrong. And he continued to teach that Christ had returned spiritually in 1874, like he had learned from Barber. But then he added that in 1914, Christ was going to return to the earth and judge the world and set up his kingdom in 1914. So this is his first prophecy that he had set up. In 1881, very early on, he wrote a tract called Food for Thinking Christians. And it was a specific tract to be handed out at churches. It attacked Christian churches, it attacked governments, it attacked the whole world system as being under the control of Satan, and said that his teachings, Russell's teachings, were the only true message of God. He distributed 1 million copies of this tract outside of many churches in America, and that tract became a very effective tool to attract people, and it actually started helping him build his ministry. He set up 30 congregations of followers very early on in that work, and he was successful and actually so successful financial that he was able to buy a huge piece of property in New York City that still belongs to the Watchtower organization today. And he formed the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society and created this huge headquarters building, and he continued to produce more and more magazines and more books to be able to continue to send out and to continue to get more people involved in his religious movement. He began regularly printing the Watchtower magazine. And the interesting thing about it, once again, look at the cover, the Watchtower and Herald of Christ's Presence. His teaching was, Christ is here, Christ's presence is here, he's coming in 1941 to destroy the rest of the world, and only Russell's followers will be saved in this. But many Christians, they see this magazine, they go, oh, that looks like a really neat Christian magazine. It's got Christian symbols on it and all this kind of stuff. And they would pick it up and they'd read it thinking it's a normal religious publication. And he attacked churches, he attacked Christians, he attacked the world system, and he got people to think about it and listen to him, and really built a large following early on. Now, as I said, I'm running through this history very, very quickly. Please understand that there's a lot more details involved in this. When you read, and once again, be sure to read in your textbook. There was a whole set of there was lawsuits and countersuits that went on. There were court trials. There was a time period when Russell was selling what he called miracle wheat and using that to raise lots of money for himself and all this kind of stuff. So anyway, there's so much more that you could know about the history of Jehovah's Witnesses, but I'm just trying to keep it narrowed to just the most important elements. Jehovah's Witness was able to survive past 1914 when Jesus didn't return. Now, do understand this, or understand that around 1912, 13, 14 was the beginning of World War I. 1905 began some of the Russian Revolution things, and by 1910, 11, 12, there were all these rumors of war things going on, and people were starting to think, maybe Russell was right. This is it. This is the end of the world. And then it didn't happen. And Jesus didn't return, all this kind of stuff. Then in 1916, Russell himself died, but the Jehovah's Witness religion was able to continue because there were other leaders that came up in the organization and continued to promote many of Russell's ideas and change them whenever they needed to, and continued the Jehovah's Witness religion. One of the most powerful and most important figures in the history of Jehovah's Witness religion is Joseph Rutherford. He went by the name Judge Joseph Rutherford. And after Russell's death, there was actually a power struggle. Russell's wife wanted to become the leader of this new religious group, but Rutherford actually kind of took it over in a coup attempt, and he actually captured the larger group. Now, for quite some time, there were actually two groups. There was actually the groups that kept the name Bible Students, and they were the ones who followed Russell's wife and continued to follow his basic teachings. And then there was a group, the bigger part of the group went with Rutherford and continued the Jehovah's Witness religious group. He was a much better organizer, more powerful leader, and more prolific writer. He wrote hundreds of books and thousands of tracts that he used to help build the Jehovah's Witness religion. He's really the one that helped the Jehovah's Witness religion to survive and to become what it is today. And he made several changes in the organization, and it changed the doctrines to make it fit in a different way than it had, to make it to where they could continue to teach the things they were teaching. And he began this process that continues even today, of changing the doctrines and changing the teachings to fit whatever needs to be going on in the religion. There are things that are going on, that have gone on the last 20 to 30 years that they've had to change their teachings on. And their general practice is to change the teaching and pretend like the old teaching never existed, is a typical thing that Jehovah's Witnesses do. Some examples of changes he made. He wrote a book, and in this book he actually, in 1930, he simply changed Watchtower teachings about the specific dates of Christ's return to cover Russell's failed prophecy. All of a sudden, there was no mention of 1874 anymore. Now, the new teaching was that Jesus returned invisibly to earth in 1914 and not in 1874. So this had a dual effect. First of all, it got rid of that 1874 date that's now an embarrassment. And it covered the 1914 prophecy by saying, well, Jesus did return. He just returned invisibly in 1914. So and once again, from that point on, starting in 1930, the year 1874 never appears in their literature, and they will, if you talk to them today, they will tell you they've never, ever prophesied. Nobody ever prophesied an 1874 return, and nobody said Jesus was coming physically in 1914. It was invisibly. So it's all in print. It's in print in these magazines that still exist in places, but if you talk to a Jehovah's Witness today, they'll deny that any of that ever happened. Now, once again, look at the name of this magazine. This is the last time you're going to see it, because now we go to the new magazine. And you see the name of it. He changed the name of the organization in 1939. It had been the Watchtower Proclaiming Christ's Presence. It now became and now still is the Watchtower Announcing Jehovah's Kingdom. There was a huge theological shift that took place here, where the old focus had been on Jesus' invisible presence and on Jesus coming and destroying all the world systems and all of Christendom being evil and all this kind of stuff. Well, now they've still kept those teachings that Christendom is evil and all this kind of thing, but they shifted the attention away from Jesus, really, and started shifting their attention to this name Jehovah being the name of God, and Jehovah's kingdom is what Christ was coming to bring. And so once again, this is a huge theological shift that took place, the renaming of the thing, the re-emphasis of the doctrine, the name. As a matter of fact, if you talk to Jehovah's Witnesses today, one of their lead lines is, do you know God's covenant name? Do you know God's actual name? And that's because Rutherford changed the focus from Christ's presence to God's name and God being Jehovah God. One other example of Rutherford's work, he actually wrote a book in the 1920, I believe it was, and he actually had a series of lectures that was involved in this as well, that was called Millions Now Living Will Never Die. And that was actually the 1920s, that was the kind of, that they would put up banners, millions now living will never die. And he prophesied that the earthly resurrection was going to begin in 1925, that the faithful men of old, the people who were part of God's people from the old times, men like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they would arise and begin their work preparing the world for Christ's return when everything was destroyed and everything was made new. So he wrote this prophecy in 1920. He put it in writing. That's the mistake they continually make, because then they have to go back and retract what they said or re-explain what they said or whatever else. Now, if you were to show a Jehovah's Witness today a copy of Millions Now Living Will Never Die and say, here's what Rutherford wrote, they would just tell you, well, that's a faked copy. That's not what he wrote. So understand that even though you can know, and I've got a book in our bibliography that's just particularly about Jehovah's Witness literature and all the things that they've changed throughout history. It can be effective if a person's really wanting to leave Jehovah's Witness, but if they're not wanting to leave Jehovah's Witness, they'll just say, someone made that up, someone reproduced that, someone did it on a computer, it's not real, even though it's actually in the actual book written by them. So anyway, he prophesied this, and the amazing thing is, when 1925 came and went, he didn't even stop teaching it. He just kept on saying, well, this earthly resurrection is going to come soon. The end of Christendom is going to come soon. The return of Eden to earth is going to come soon. And he was so certain of it that in 1929 he bought a house in San Diego called Beth Sarim, and it's called the House of Princes. And this house was supposed to be specifically for Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and those guys. When they were resurrected, this is where they were going to get to live while they were doing their work along with the Jehovah's Witnesses. And he even wrote, and if you read there was another book he wrote later on, and actually he wrote the book in 1939, I believe, where he described this particular location and how they made sure that it was a location that would be a similar climate to Israel, so that these princes would feel at home when they came to live there when they arose. And so, once again, this is just the kind of thing that you see throughout. And really all we've talked about has just been the first two leaders. We talked about Russell and we talked about Rutherford. There were so many other leaders that have come and went over the year, and through the manipulation of its followers, Jehovah's Witness religion has become a strong, organized. And actually the reason I kind of put this slide together is they just recently completed a new headquarters. That old building that you'll see at the beginning of many of the slide presentations is no longer their official headquarters. They still own that property in New York, but this is now their new headquarters building. It's an organization that brings in millions of dollars a month, and its publishing empire. People who say they're not following the teachings of Russell. Matter of fact, they say they're not following any man. That Jehovah himself speaks through the Watchtower organization, and that's who they're following. And so that's the reason that having a knowledge of their history is worthwhile for a student who's just trying to understand them. However, it doesn't really help that much when you're trying to have a conversation with them. As a matter of fact, in our text, you'll see that there's a lot of what's talked about there is how much they deny their own history. They ignore their own history. They reinterpret their own history. They deny that it ever happened. They deny the prophecies ever took place. And so, unless you want to become a real student of Jehovah's Witness religion and become one of those experts that can teach others, it's unlikely that you really, digging into it just about drives you crazy, to tell you the truth. Here's the list I mentioned a little earlier. The history is so complicated. It is so very complicated to see all the times they've prophesied. In my lifetime, I was born in 1965. I can still remember in the early 1970s that there was a huge push by the Jehovah's Witnesses because, interestingly enough, it's all kind of weird. They denied that they ever said that Jesus was going to come in 1874. They wrote that out of their books. But all of a sudden they began saying that Jesus was going to come before 1975, exactly 100 years after Barber's failed prophecy. And it was a huge, big deal. The Jehovah's Witnesses were having tent crusades. They were going door to door, handing out stuff. In 1973 and 74, you've got to become a Jehovah's Witness now. Accept Jehovah's Witness teachings now before it's too late. The end of the world is coming in 1974. You've got to, and it didn't happen. And they literally lost millions of Jehovah's Witness followers from that. But the amazing thing is millions stayed. And they just erased that section of their history. And today, if you ask them, they'll say, oh, no, we never prophesied the end of the world in 1974. That's all a lie. That was a lie thought up by the leaders of Christendom. We never did that. And as I said, it's exasperating because I know they did. We've got copies of the magazines in which they were saying this is going to happen. And now if you show it to them, oh, that was just somebody did that on Photoshop. That's not even real. So anyway, all that just to say, if you really want to dig into some of the deeper into some of this, these are excellent books. This one on the Jehovah's Witness claims and doctrinal changes, what the Watchtower Society doesn't want you to know. Some excellent books here, along with some of the other books that are in our bibliography for further study. If you know someone who's involved in Jehovah's Witness religion, a friend, a family member, something like that, you may want to dig into some of these books and get some good information, to perhaps have some ammunition to help get them free from the teachings of this cult. So anyway, wanted to keep this as short as possible. That's going to be all we're going to talk about the history. After this, we're going to enter into some other discussions about other aspects of the Jehovah's Witness religion. As always, if you have questions, feel free to give me a call or give me a text, or mainly send me an email. That's the best way of getting a hold of me. I don't always answer my phone. I don't always answer my texts. I'm old. I answer emails. So anyway, look forward to talking to you guys later. Bye-bye.